Operating a mortar in the Second World War was a death sentence. It exposed positions, drew direct enemy fire, and left 85% of its crew either limbless or dead. But how did such a powerful weapon do more damage to its own instead of the enemy? And why was one man a hero for sacrificing his own life? The mortar has a history as old as time. In fact, it was one of the first forms of artillery used as early as the 15th century, when Korean gunsmiths developed the wangu. Yet it would be used all the way up to the 21st century on the battlefields of Iraq, and now even in Ukraine. It wasn't until 1915 that one British inventor, Sir Wilfrid Stokes, designed the first version that would resemble what a modern mortar looks like. Known as the Stokes mortar, it was transportable by one person, working perfectly in the trenches to strike the enemy from afar. But it wouldn't be until the Second World War that mortars were truly perfected as artillery that could change the battlefield. As the Second World War erupted, each nation had perfected its own version. Most popular was the United States M2 mortar, firing a 60mm round, capable of shooting 18 rounds per minute. Yet, on the other side of the battlefield, the Germans were not to be outdone, creating the impressive 8cm Granatwerfer 34, an 81.4mm cannon that could fire up to 25 rounds per minute. For the British, the Ordnance ML 3-inch mortar, also featuring an 81mm shell, would be the weapon of choice. Regardless of the option, each of these mortars would prove incredibly vital on the battlefield, being used to not only drive back forces, but also create suppressing fire that would assist in setting up various tactics for attack and defense. The only problem was that firing a mortar often required a bit of luck, and unlike modern versions, there was no satellite technology to guide rounds to their intended targets.
My reaction to combat was simply following those orders and dropping the mortar shells down the barrel and firing them. Now, the mortar shells themselves weighed about 25 pounds and had about 12 pounds of TNT in them, so they were really vicious.
So, how did a mortar work on the battlefield? The purpose of mortar deployment was broken up into one of 4 different strategies: neutralizing, morale, lethal, and material. When the enemy attacked, mortars were deployed with rapid fire that kept them suppressed. Each mortar shell was not necessarily aimed to inflict damage, but to create the illusion of a constant barrage that would pin the enemies down, preventing them from attacking. If they were already dug in, a more lethal approach was needed. Here, the attacking force used the mortar to target specific locations like strongholds, pillboxes, and even command posts. The same tactic also played out when attacking enemy material like tanks or other large weaponry. Then, finally, it was used to significantly destroy the morale of the enemy, with hundreds of mortar shells falling around them like rain from the clouds and creating a sense of overwhelming force that broke the enemy morale. All these tactics played out in various theaters of the Second World War, leading to some of the most famous battles ever recorded, like the Normandy invasions. As the Allies prepared for the Normandy landings, long-range incoming fire from Nazi positions was always going to be a big obstacle. The United States deployed the 81st and 87th Chemical Mortar Battalions as early regiments to land on the beaches. But their first missions were not to wipe out the enemy. To prove the versatility of the mortar, these battalions quickly moved around 200 yards inland, where they set up positions and fired into the enemy lines. However, facing massive machine gun fire, smoke was used. It provided a clear smoke screen that prevented the Germans from seeing the incoming Allied forces. This provided a little extra cover on the open beaches, but without a clear sight on target, the Germans had to either expose themselves or allow for the smoke to clear, which by then meant that the Allies were already moving up the beaches. By the time the dust settled, these chemical mortar battalions didn't just help destroy German positions, but provided cover that helped the Allies effectively storm these German positions, and in many cases even overrun them. The mortars proved effective on both sides of the war, leaving mass casualties that are still hard to comprehend. Yet those firing them knew they probably wouldn't return to tell their stories. Despite the effectiveness of the mortar on the battlefield, being part of a team tasked with using them was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. Unlike artillery, which was usually mounted on vehicles such as the Flak 88, the mortar had a range of just 1,000 to 3,500 yards, depending on which one was used. One of the longest was the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, with a range of about 4,500 yards. This meant that teams would not have the luxury of having miles between themselves and the enemy, and most mortar teams were deployed directly on the front lines. The Germans were particularly good at directing mortar fire, often using tactics that directed all the fire at one location. This usually happened once they got sight of an Allied mortar trying to prevent the movement of troops. Wehrmacht operators turned all their mortars on one location, bombarding them with shell after shell until the only thing left was a plume of smoke and silence. In fact, it happened so quickly that the Allies barely had the opportunity to respond. But one of the biggest problems with operating a mortar was when the enemy got too close. Since guerrilla tactics were employed, smaller groups of soldiers would set up ambush positions. Once mortar teams set up, and before the infantry could take strategic protective positions, these small groups of soldiers would pop up and move close to the mortar positions. Since aiming was hard and the mortars needed an arch, the Germans found that when they were close to the mortars, they became useless. They'd storm these positions, destroying them and the operators responsible for firing. But being a cheap and effective way of striking targets, both sides of the war continued sending more and more mortars to the battlefield. As such, the casualties kept on mounting, but when soldiers found themselves in an intense battle, the mortar often stepped in to save the day. As the Allies were closing in on Berlin, the 39th and 9th Infantry Divisions, with U.S. Army Technical Sergeant Peter Joseph D'Alessandro, were holding an important road junction on high ground near Kulterherberg. Facing devastating mortar and artillery fire during the evening of December 22, 1944, their positions became threatened. The following morning, the Germans followed through with an all-out attack, threatening to overwhelm these positions. His men were becoming disorganized, pinned down by enemy fire, before he got up, braved the incoming fire to move among his men, and offered words of encouragement. Yet this wasn't enough. Realizing this, Sergeant D'Alessandro rushed to a fully exposed observation point. He adjusted the mortar and began firing on the incoming Germans. It immediately halted the German attack, but the battle wasn't done yet. Just hours later, the Germans launched a second attack, but this time, Sergeant D'Alessandro and his men were running out of ammunition. In a last-ditch effort, he crawled 30 yards to the nearest machine gun post and fired at the enemy until the machine gun jammed. Meanwhile, his troops were still in the trenches, yet the German focus was on him. The next words from his mouth would scare even the bravest soldiers. "Okay, mortars, let me have it, right in this position." He directed mortar fire to land on his own position, whereby another battalion complied. By some miracle, he survived the barrage, while many Germans lost their lives, and his team got the opportunity to get out of harm's way. Unfortunately, Sergeant D'Alessandro was captured during the battle. He'd be returned to the United States following the war, where he'd receive the Medal of Honor, proving just how valuable not only his bravery was, but how mortars could change the battlefield when all the odds were against him. But despite many mortar operators losing their lives in combat, it was still one of the most effective weapons on the battlefield. There are no concrete numbers on how many people lost their lives, specifically due to mortars. However, it is estimated that more than 70% of the 15 million people who lost their lives during combat were due to artillery fire, such as mortars. But it didn't just lead to mass casualties. What made the mortar truly devastating was the number of injuries it caused. A mortar might not have ended the life of someone, but it could easily take out a limb or even cause other severe injuries. This meant that the mortar struck fear into the hearts of the enemy, and when they were noticed on the battlefield, the enemy would direct all its fire toward it. It not only demoralized the enemy, but also provided strategic opportunities that would change the tide of battle and allow other troops to flank the opposition. But even more crucial was the versatility and mobility of the weapon. You see, despite its larger size compared to other small arms, a mortar only had a crew of 6 people on the US side. If a position became hot, it was easy to just pack up the mortar and move, which was far easier than the Flak 88. This tactic made it much harder for bombers to pinpoint locations from the air, while keeping the enemies on their toes. But speaking of the Flak 88, it wasn't just the most powerful piece of German artillery. The Flak 88 also had a casualty rate of almost 80%. If you want to find out why, check this video next.